Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Coast to Coast on the Her Hoop Stats Podcast Network. I'm Crina Mustafa alongside Calvin Wetzel. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us last week for our first ever live show. That was a blast. We talked all things W playoffs, and today we're going to get into a bunch. We're going to still talk semifinal matchups, but we got a bit of drama and new news that have kind of dropped. Saying new news was not a really good decision on my part, but we got some things to talk about today. Cal, are you ready?
I am ready. It's the semis lit, and we have all this other stuff going on in the league. Like it's happening right now.
Yeah, the new news. Anyway, let's start with our headline of the week, which is coaching carousel and the WNBA expansion draft. We'll start with the coaching stuff. You know, some of this happened last week before we recorded our live show, and people were asking, are we going to talk about Curt and the Sparks? And then the Sky also decided to fire Teresa Weatherspoon. So now we're going to talk about both of them. Curt Miller, Teresa Weatherspoon, both depart their respective teams as their coaches. Let's start with Curt in LA since that did happen first. You know, they announced that it was like they're mutually parting ways, but it somehow almost feels like it wasn't fully mutual. So I'm curious, Cal, like what are your thoughts on this kind of like end of the relationship between Curt Miller and the rebuilding Sparks?
Yeah, I've definitely heard kind of different things in terms of like how much of this was Kurt's decision or not. So I don't really know, and not trying to like start rumors or whatever. Like I kind of hope it was, because if it wasn't his decision at all, it doesn't really feel like he deserved it. Like he came into a rebuilding situation, obviously, and even aside from that, the last couple of years, the injuries piled up a lot. You had Cameron Brink this year, Lexi Brown missed a lot of time, and like I don't think I think he did a great job with what he was dealt. And this team obviously has a bright future. We've talked about the potential for CPR, Cam Page, Rakia before. So I I think he deserved to be able to stay around if he wanted to. Again, I have no idea whether he did or not. If not, like he will have some great opportunities. I think you have like the Valkyries job obviously is open, and you're going to have some other openings. We already have one we're about to talk about, and may not be the last one. So we'll see where he ends up. But yeah, we saw like Dearica Hamby tweeted, obviously, just really heartfelt, like how she felt about it, and what Curt has meant to her. And she tweeted another tweet later too, like the next day or something like that, about something like some people just want to, kind of come in and be handed everything on a silver platter, and some people willing to come in and do the dirty work, and some people want to step into that job. Yeah, I don't know who she was subtweeting, but um,
I think we can guess who. I
yeah,
think we
we'll
can
leave it
guess
at
for the
that.
shade. Yeah.
But I mean, Curt stepped into, like I said, a rebuilding situation. Like he wasn't handed an amazing situation, an amazing team on a silver platter. He came in and he did the work, and now he's not going to be there to see kind of the payoff of what happens with this young core that the Sparks are building going forward. So I think credit to Curt for that, and Dearica Hamby, obviously he's meant a lot to her. So really cool to see her share that.
Yeah, she just won the sportsmanship award that was announced today, like literally right before we started recording. And like, yeah, that's kind of what makes it weird, right? Because it seems like he had a really good relationship with the players. He had all these like cards that didn't really go his way, and it feels like the Sparks are just on the edge of like they're about to get another really good draft piece. They're about to get like in that spot where they can start to hit some consistency, like as long as everybody is healthy. And there were a lot of good things that still happened. Like Rakia Jackson was the one who was able to get a lot of the most consistent playing time. And I thought that her development over the season was fantastic, and that her ceiling is so high. And so like there's all these different things where it's like, okay, who do you now bring in? If you're LA, who do you now bring in as a head coach who can continue that? Because like, how do you find consistency if you can't have someone in a leadership position be consistent? Like throughout the time that you're trying to build out your roster, you need someone who's building these relationships with the players and like understands your personnel and like the direction of the team. So this is a very interesting situation. Like you said, there are some job openings that are available, such as the Valkyries. such as the Chicago Sky. Although, like, to me, it wouldn't make sense for Curt to go there because it's like, why go from one rebuilding team to another, especially if it was like any part of it was his decision. I imagine that it wouldn't be for a job like Chicago. But speaking of Chicago, let's get into it because we thought we were going to get hit with one big coaching news. We got hit with what felt like an even bigger one with Teaspoon being fired from the Chicago Sky. And shout out Annie Costabile. We have shouted out her reporting a ton on this podcast because she honestly does such a great job, and she's the one who came out with this news. And I'm just gonna talk a little bit about what was written in the article that she wrote based on the reporting that she did. It seems like the big word here was inexperience, with Teaspoon being a first-time head coach in the W. And there's a certain quote that you and I are going to kind of dissect a little bit because it feels a little questionable. And that quote is, "Players were outwardly supportive of Weatherspoon throughout the year. However, during exit interviews, it became evident that there was some disconnect. Multiple players noted the changing playing style throughout the year and mentioned the learning curve of being a first-year coach." The disconnect part is interesting because we talked about players that have like kind of reached out and talked about the coaches being fired, with like Hamby doing that with Curt. Angel Reese spoke out nearly immediately as soon as this news dropped and had some pretty clear and concise wording on like how she felt about the Teaspoon firing, and it does not feel like there was any disconnect there. And it also feels like these players are finding out just like us, like through this reporting and through social media. Like, it doesn't really seem like anybody's on the same page here. And so like maybe that's where the disconnect is, not necessarily between the players and, you know, the head coach, but just like the disconnect and transparency. But Cal, I know that was a little bit of a tangent, but like a little bit of a rant, but like, what do you think about this Teaspoon firing, and like, what do we make of all this?
It's baffling to me. I don't know, like, what else do you want her to do? Like, from a basketball perspective, I would love to know more about what this disconnect is. Obviously, Angel didn't feel any type of disconnect based on what she tweeted, and even before that, it was clear that they had a great relationship, and Angel considered Teaspoon such a
Yeah.
mentor, coming into this league as a Black woman and as a young star, which Teaspoon was.
We even talked about it on this podcast, like from the beginning of the season throughout. We talked about like how they are leaning on each other and how it really seems like Teaspoon was making an impact on like Angel's rookie year. So like this is like the word is right. Like, it is baffling.
Yeah, like, so just from a purely, not even purely basketball, like from a basketball standpoint, but also from a like a leadership standpoint, I don't really know like what exactly you expected of her that wasn't accomplished. Like, you can say, oh, we wanted to get to the playoffs, but like, did you really? Was that actually the ideal situation for this team? Like, we talked about it before. Like, it's not just like you can say, okay, it's great. They shouldn't have actually wanted to make the playoffs because they wanted to get into the lottery. But you can say like playoffs helps develop experience. But a lot of their players were injured down the stretch that would have benefited from the playoff experience anyway. They were in a playoff spot for 99% of the year until the final hours of the season. And that was with a roster that I think most of us thought was going to be 11th or 12th in the league coming into the year, and midway through the season, trading away your best scorer in Marina Mabry. You basically had no one on this team outside of her. And then you brought in Rachel Banham, who could shoot outside of like 15 feet. Like, it's not like you talked about the hand Curt was dealt. It's not like she was dealt some like incredibly high level, talented, experienced roster and like didn't have the success that you would have expected with it. Like, quite the opposite. In fact, I thought she did an outstanding job all around. The vibes were great from a basketball standpoint. Like, getting ninth or even being in the playoff conversation at all was very impressive, in my opinion, in year one for this core and these young players. Developing Angel into what she already is after 1 year. Camila Cardoso, who started out the season injured and then becoming what she has. I just don't get it. I don't know what else you're looking for if you're the Chicago Sky. It makes no sense to me.
Right. And I pose the same question now where it's like, okay, so you fire Teaspoon. Who do you bring in now that your players clearly feel betrayed by this decision. Now you got to bring in a coach who is supposed to like re-establish themselves and re-establish their relationships with the players and continue what Teaspoon kind of started with this group. And a lot of people have talked about it. It really does feel like they overachieved this year for what they had. And like, if they were healthy, yeah, they probably would have made it in the playoffs, probably to get swept by the Liberty in round one. But like, that was the ceiling for this team. And I'm not really sure if this like, and there's also the part of the conversation where it's like, okay, why is a coach who is a Black woman, a first time head coach, not being given the same grace as a lot of other coaches throughout many leagues, including this one? Because there's that part of the conversation too, especially when you hire executives after the head coach was hired. And it's like, okay, what's going on here? Because this does not seem like the right resolution to whatever issues you had.
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head because like you can talk about the inexperience in the first year head coach and the learning curve, but like everyone has that. And how do you become a second year head coach and develop that coaching experience if you're not allowed to work through the first year stuff? And I think like Black women more than anyone aren't afforded that opportunity to come in and just be a first year head coach and kind of develop along with some of their young players. And I mean, I have no doubt in my mind, like Teaspoon would have been a better coach next year than she was this year. She would have been a better coach the year after
Yeah.
that than she would. And I say would have, but she will be, I hope, because I think she deserves to land somewhere too. Someone definitely should give her an opportunity after what she did this year. And I still think she has a coach of the year award at some point in her future. Apparently not with
Yeah.
the Sky. I thought it would be with the Sky, but just as a Black woman, like it, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what else to say about it. It just makes me really angry, to be honest.
Yeah. It's like literally, and I'm gonna use your word again, like just baffling. I think both of these coaching moves have been baffling, and I'm very, very interested to see what the next step is for both of these teams because they're kind of in similar positions here. And where do you go from here? Especially with, Golden State coming in next year, seeing who kind of takes that spot as well. But yeah, just an interesting piece of news to happen this week on the coaching end of it. I didn't think we were going to be back talking about the coaching carousel this early. Like the season's not even over. And like this is normally what we talk about in the off season. But anyway, it's an interesting time. Speaking of interesting times and expansion teams in Golden State, the WNBA finally released expansion draft rules. And that's going to take place. The draft itself is going to take place on December 6th. We still don't have lottery rules and like that specific part of it. So hopefully that comes along soon. But here is basically how it's going to go down because like there's a lot of words here, and if let's just dissect this together as a family. Basically what's going to be able to happen is teams, like every other team in the league, the other 12 teams are going to be able to protect 6 players on their team who will not be available for selection by Golden State. And then everybody else on their roster is eligible. But then here's where it gets kind of messy with like the rules and like who's actually available and who isn't. Basically, if you're an unrestricted free agent next year, and you're not signed on, you can still be protected. So like they have like different rules here. I'm just, you know what? I thought I was going to be able to like condense this. I'm just going to read the words and then we're going to talk
Go for it.
about it.
Go for it.
Per the release, it says the Valkyries will only be able to choose one player from every team and can select players without regard to the salary cap, but they have to be below the cap at the start of the signing period in February. So that part, so straightforward. If you don't understand it, then I feel bad for the rest of this conversation for you.
Tough
But
luck.
basically the rules that I want to get into for the unrestricted free agent stuff, if a player is not signed to a contract for the 2025 season, if you're selected, Golden State will receive whatever rights to the player the existing team would have had if that player was not selected in the draft. The Valkyries will only be able to select one player in the expansion draft who is eligible to become an unrestricted free agent following the 2024 season. So you can't choose, like, if you're Golden State, you can't choose like multiple free agents on each team. That's just not how it works. They may choose a player provided that the player has not previously played to a core player contract for 2 or more seasons. Golden State may then designate that player as its one core player in January. Any unrestricted free agents not selected in the expansion draft and not designated as a core player by their current team may be signed by any team, including Golden State, once free agency starts in February. So basically, if Golden State and your team says, we don't want you, you have until February to become a free agent, and then you can figure out everything from there. I do want to shout out Richard Cohen, as always, breaking it down for everybody, as well as No Cap Space, because they're quick, including our own Tyler, who's now one of the hosts of Press Break on the Her Hoops Ass Podcast Network. They broke it down. They were so quick, and I'm going to be using their article, so make sure that you go check that out on No Cap Space. Just to like see which players could potentially be available for every team in the league, and like which of the players stand out to us. If the rules still confuse you, I suggest you go follow somebody smarter than me, maybe Alexa on Twitter. Richard, like I said, will always try to break it down. But yeah, Cal, do you have another way to break this down in a way that's like easier to understand?
I can give it a shot. We'll see. Let you people in the comments let me know how I did. So with the unrestricted free agent part, first off, uh the Valkyries can select one player of the outside of the 6 who were protected from any one team. So from 7th on down, they can select one player from the Liberty, one from the Aces, etc. They can't take
Yeah,
2
yeah,
from the same team. A lot of those are going to be unrestricted free agents, but they can still take, like you said, one total. So if they take an unrestricted free agent from like the sky, then they can't take an unrestricted free agent from any other team. Every other pick that they
correct.
make cannot be an unrestricted free agent. But the core thing, that's the key. If you're not familiar with core, go look it up on the Herb Stats website. They have the CBA FAQ. Obviously, go check that out. But basically, the core is a kind of a designation for if you're an unrestricted free agent and your team wants to keep you still, they can sort of force you to stay by giving you a core designation. And I don't remember the exact salary that comes with that. I think it changes. I might be wrong about that. But basically, then you're playing rather than like negotiating and signing a new deal, you're just playing under this 1 year core deal. But any given player can only have that happen to them twice throughout their career, regardless of which team it happens with. If you have it, if your original team cores you 2 years in a row, and then you go sign with a different team later in your career, your new team can never core you again because you've already had that happen twice in your career. So the players who that is true for, who have already been cored twice in their career, they don't need to be protected among the 6, and the in Golden State has like no use for taking them anyway, because the one unrestricted free agent that Golden State can take, the only point in taking a free agent is if Golden State applies that core to them so that they
Yeah.
can keep them. Otherwise, they would just become a free agent anyway, and it doesn't matter that Golden State took them; they can still go sign wherever they want.
Mhm.
So some of the players, I think Richard Cohen laid them all out. Some of the players who that applies to, but the biggest one to me, I think, the biggest team who this applies to is the Connecticut Sun, because DeWanna Bonner and Bree Jones have both been cored twice in their career already, which means that the Sun have no need to protect either of those 2 players because Golden State has no use. I don't know if it's against the rules or if it's just pointless, but either way, like they won't be protecting those two players. Golden State won't be taking those two players in their draft because they wouldn't be able to keep them either way. So that's going to allow the Sun to keep some players who they maybe otherwise, or to protect some players who they maybe otherwise wouldn't be able to protect. Go a
Hmm.
little bit further down the list. Players like maybe Olivia Nelson-Adota, Veronica Burton, who we've seen have some great playoff minutes, because they can sort of protect 8 players in a sense instead of 6. Not that you actually, you're still going to have to negotiate in free agency with Bonner and Bree Jones, but
Yeah.
so that's kind of, I don't know if that made any sense to any of our listeners. Maybe not, but
That
that's
made
the way I
way more
understand
sense than what I said, because I
it.
understand it, but I can't say it, which is not really good advertising for me as a podcast host, but like it's fine. The other team also that I do want to mention is that Seattle doesn't like doesn't need to really like they can protect their players, but like the Valkyries can't really pick anybody else outside the players that they protect because of that unrestricted free agent clause with the players that have been cored twice already. Um they already kind of fit that category. So the teams that we kind of looked at are outside of Seattle and Connecticut, I would say. Would you agree with that, Cal?
Yeah. Hmm.
Okay, cool. And I know there's a lot of names here, and on the show notes, you said that I took them all. I merely wrote them down as a point of discussion for us both. I was not trying to take all the players in the expansion draft. But there are a couple of Canadians on my list, as you so adequately pointed out. I have Kia Nurse, Leticia Ame here, both players that could potentially be selected by the Golden State Valkyries in the draft. Those two are very interesting to me. Kia Nurse is interesting to me because I'm not really sure where she fits right now, especially with LA. I don't think it was the best year that she had. Just like had a lot of injuries that she struggled with this year, and that kind of translated through with Team Canada stuff in the Olympics, and with LA never really being able to be a consistent team this year, and like low key, she was also there because of Curt, because Curt talked multiple times about recruiting her, all the way back to her UConn days before she decided to sign with UConn. And like just talking to her and Curt in Edmonton this year, it was very clear that like this was a full circle moment for them, that they finally got to be on the same team. So now that Curt's not there, maybe he takes that Valkyries head coach position, and maybe she's a player that he kind of tries to target again. It's like very interesting to me, especially also with her being like a little bit later in her career. I wonder how many years are left in her playing career with the injuries, and just like she's getting more into her broadcasting bag. Like she has a pretty good gig with the Raptors here in Toronto. So there's a lot of different factors here that I kind of look at with Kia. And then Leticia Ame here, who we've talked about a bunch. Atlanta is just not the spot for her. Point blank. We've talked about this before. Atlanta is not the spot for her right now. We talk about coaches. I'm interested to see what kind of happens with Tanisha over there. With the direction that they're kind of trying to head in. Obviously has 2 more years left on her coaching contract, but yeah, I think this would be an interesting place for just kind of like a reset, a start over. She signed with the Perth Lynx for the off season, so getting some of those international reps in might actually help her for this upcoming draft. Maybe she's a player that Golden State looks at, and maybe that's a place that she can get more playing time and kind of develop more into the player that she needs to be. But yeah, those are the two Canadians that I kind of have on my list. Haley Jones is another player that could also be potentially targeted by Golden State, which honestly, like, that kind of entices me too. Haley having her own team, maybe like, or like a team where she's a little bit more like dominant and has a bigger role. That intrigues me, Cal. What do you think?
Yeah, I'll be interested to see first off, so just some of these players. And okay, I'll say so Ari, friend of the pod, reported that the protections are not going to be public, which I think is dumb. So we might not actually know, but I will be interested to see if some of those fringe players like Haley Jones, I feel like we'll find out in the end, like if they get drafted or not. If they didn't get drafted, like they must have been protected, right? Like so
Yeah.
some of those fringe players, because there's some players like Haley Jones who I feel like maybe could be sort of a fringe, like 6th or 7th on your protection list. and some players are like clearly getting protected or clearly not. But yeah, you mentioned Tyler and his article on no cap space. Go check that out. Based on who he is kind of projecting will be protected and will not be. A lot of interesting names. You brought up LA, Haley Jones, Kate Martin. I could see the Aces protecting Kate Martin. Honestly, I would have to seriously think about it if I were them, but uh,
Yeah.
she could potentially be on the list if not. Grace Berger, Emily Engsler. I'm reading some of the names now that you wrote down here that
That I
you
took.
yeah, that you stole. I'm stealing them back. Uh,
Yeah.
Diamond Miller is a big one. I think to me, like the biggest thing that I am very excited to see next year is a lot of these players. You called it kind of a reset. I think a lot of these players who are recently high draft picks, a lot of talent, still pretty young, but things haven't necessarily worked out for whatever reason on the team that they're at right now, like might have a chance to really go prove themselves on a team who's going to have a lot of minutes, a lot of volume, a lot of opportunity open because the Valkyries aren't going to have any like MVP candidates or anything. So it's going to be a lot like Diamond Miller, if she ends up there, is going to be facing a lot less competition for minutes and playing time than she is on a really deep, good Lynx team right now. And
Yeah.
a lot of other players like that. So I'm very interested to see like some players get maybe sort of a second chance or hit the reset button and see how it plays out in Golden State. And I'm sure Golden State will be targeting some of those young players too. Like your list here has 4 lottery picks from the last 3 years: Melissa Smith, Emily Engsler, Haley Jones, Diamond Miller. A lot of
I was
talent.
just gonna say, speaking of players who might want to refresh or restart, Alyssa Smith is a really, really intriguing one because I think we can all tell she's not the happiest in Indiana. I think there's been a lot of growing pains the last couple of years, and especially this year where we saw lower playoff minutes for her. It seemed like a goodbye post, but like she said it wasn't after their playoff run was over. I think that's a player who, and I don't want to use the word disgruntled, but is a little bit frustrated with the role that they have. And we'll see some of these other Fever players too. If they kind of stick around, like looking at Kelsey Mitchell, seeing what's going to happen with her as well. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting player to me who lots of talent, lots of potential to keep playing. May look to get a few more minutes on an expansion team. There's some other players here. Emily Engsler, yeah, that you mentioned. I thought she was really solid with Washington to close out the season. I think we saw more of what Emily in a role that she's most comfortable in. I think we saw more of that. Izzy Harrison could be a good decision if like, whatever goes on with Chicago, whatever is going on over there with what the future of the roster is and like having players who are happy or unhappy. Um, yeah, those are the players that kind of stuck out to me. Grace Berger being another Indiana Fever player who was getting minutes, just last year, and this year has obviously been different for many reasons. But yeah, I noticed you. I noticed you wrote here, Kayla Thornton. That's interesting to me too. What do you kind of see for her? Especially like she had a great game too for New York. What are your thoughts on that and her potentially getting drafted?
Yeah, well, going off of Tyler's list, he was projecting that New York would keep Nyara Sabali over Kayla Thornton at that 6th spot. And I'm not sure. I'm going to have to ask our friend and Liberty beat reporter Miles Ehrlich what he thinks about it, because I think that doesn't seem like a clear-cut decision to me when you look at those two. But obviously, Kayla Thornton has provided more right now. I think Sabali has, more of a future in terms of how young
Yeah,
she is still and an upside, and it depends what you're going for New York and then what you're going for Golden State. But if Kayla Thornton doesn't get protected, if Tyler's projection is correct here, then I think that's a very interesting one to look at if you're Golden State, because you want to get all these young players in and hope that one of those former lottery picks from the last few years who hasn't panned out yet ends up becoming a star on your team. But I think you also want at least 1 or 2 vets, and Izzy Harrison's another one you mentioned, who can
yeah,
kinda come in and sort of set the tone and practice, and players who have, been here for a little while in the WNBA, and especially a player like Kayla Thornton, who is always gonna work her butt off and defend, and I think someone like that could be really good for some of the younger players who Golden State gets in there to spend a year or two with. Probably a year, because with the CBA coming up, everyone's going to be a free agent a year from now. But that was
Just
when
wait
I
till our expansion draft pod in freaking
yeah.
2026
Oh
with
boy,
Toronto and Portland.
it's going to
So
be
yeah.
wild.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. Like you want to have a good mix of players who are still young and up and coming, but you need a sort of like veteran presence, especially with the newest expansion team, to kind of make sure you hold everybody together and like make sure there are things that you need to do or like things that you need to learn. So yeah, I think we can wrap this up with saying that it is so dumb that these lists are not going to be public. Like it would actually like this is a great situation where you could pitch a WNBA reality show and just like have all of these players in like their own like houses and just like have the drama of saying like you are protected and like these players are not, and then like doing seeing all these negotiations. I don't know, that could be a fun like content idea. But I hope some of our W newsbreakers and more investigative reporters, whether that's like Christina, whether that's like Rachel. I know Rachel went into retirement as well. Retirement out of news breaking, I should say, not retirement overall. But maybe we can get some more insider stuff. Maybe Richard can do some more poking around too, just to get us that information. I'm sure Annie will also be on top of that as well. It costs a while. So yeah, I don't know. I just think we're nosy. I think there's like the attention is more than ever onto this side of things. So why not give the people what they want and just say which players are protected and which aren't, and how we're going to move with things like that. If players want to like tweet about it, if you're a player and you're listening to this right now and you want to tweet about what is going on with your teams and like whether you were protected or not and whatever the tea is, feel free to like drop little hints. We won't say anything, but yeah, I think that's where I'm at, Cal. I think we're nosy and we'd like to know. We'd like to have fun.
I'm with you. Give the people what they want. We're nosy.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, let's talk actual basketball now and the playoffs. Thanks for sticking with us with the coaching carousel and draft expansion rules. Well, let's talk about the actual basketball that is still being played. Both semifinal series are in two different spots right now. We'll talk Aces Liberty first since they have been going first so far. The Liberty go up 2-0 on the defending champs. They will now travel to Vegas for game 3, but game 2, what a game 2, because that was even closer than game 1. And I just think that this series has just been incredible so far. I want to ask you, since the Liberty are on top, since they are rolling, what have they done well so far to have themselves in this position?
Been so impressed with their defense. I think they've made life really difficult for Asia Wilson, and she's still putting up some numbers because she's Asia Wilson. It's what she does, and including assist numbers, which is usually not part of her statistical profile. But she's been finding people out of all the doubles. She's tied for the Aces lead in this series in assists. A lot of hockey assists. You saw him talk about that on the broadcast last night. And in game 2, I think the Aces kept it closer because some of those other players were able to hit those shots. When they showed Asia a crowd. Alicia Clark was 3 for 7 from deep. Jackie was 4 for 8. Kelsey Plum was 2 for 5. Obviously, they need that if the Liberty are going to play Asia how they have, but it still wasn't enough. And like, if you put these clips up, like one thing that I've been impressed with New York is how they send these crowds before the ball even gets there. Look at this steal on that pass into Asia, and then here again trying to get the ball into Asia. Phoebish comes in. Like, they're not even always waiting until Asia gets the ball and then sending a double or until she gets the move. Like, they're sending people on the flight of the pass and making it hard for the Aces to even get the ball into their MVP, which has
Mhm.
been really big. And so, I mean, there's only so much Asia can do. Obviously, like you can talk about her passing out of doubles, but if she can't get the ball, she can't make that pass out of the double. I think the Liberty have done an excellent job on her.
Yeah, that's really important because when she has the ball in her hands, she can do pretty much anything. So the
Yeah.
fact that they're
Yep.
disrupting that, I think, has been super important. And like, you know, I was gonna say we talked about, but I've been on so many podcasts over the last week. I have no idea what I've talked about on which podcast. Because I was gonna say we talked about Chelsea Gray, getting disrupted, but I think I talked about that on Mark's podcast. But they did a good job of disrupting Chelsea Gray in game one as well too. Like only had one assist. Like you talk about getting ahead of things. I think these are important examples of that. So please forgive me for not remembering which podcast I talked
That
about
was
it
Mark's
on.
podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. There you
I
go.
remember it.
Let's talk about some players that are kind of sticking out to you, maybe the New York side of things, especially still, because we talked a lot about, Sabrina Ionescu's development last week. And I think we've seen that continue this week as well into games too. Like just watching how she makes decisions really quickly too, and like does them really efficiently has been huge for the success of this team so far. But who else has kind of stood out to you in terms of like players for New York?
Yeah, well, first of all, when you put, you mentioned Sab in our notes, like I just think we should copy and paste our notes from last
I just
week and
have
put,
to, right? Like,
yeah, like
ugh, yeah.
every week, like we can talk about Sabrina and her growth just kind of on a loop and what she's done. But to me, another thing that you and Mark talked about on your podcast, which everyone should go listen to, by the way, was Sloot. I think Mark brought up what Sloot has been doing off the bench, and obviously, like Mark said, like this would not be her first choice. Like no one of of her caliber like wants to come off the bench, right? But it would be so easy, I think, like at this point in her career, from her perspective and from the team perspective, for her to sort of like fade into obscurity given this move in the starting lineup. But instead, she has come in and had a massive impact, I think, on this series, and especially like in game two, whether it's like making a big defensive play, hitting a shot. Like to me, this is from the team perspective, like it's allowed them to kind of keep her fresh with her minutes, like pick their spots, like depending on the lineups and the matchups. And from her perspective, like this is Hall of Fame material to me, and not that like I want to talk about this, like not that she wasn't a Hall of Famer before, like the last 2 weeks when she was coming off the bench or whatever, but I just think this like this stretch that she's on right now like cements her status as just like an icon, an absolute legend, because it's not just about your peak. Like people have really really great peaks, and that's cool, but to me, like when you're past your prime, what are you able to provide the team? Like, are you able to come in and still make an impact on the game in your minutes? Are you able to make plays like when you're not at your top form anymore? And like what you do at that point in your career, I think, is like just as much a part of your legacy as what you do in your prime. And I think some of the all-time greats that we've seen in across any sport have had incredible longevity and made really significant impacts well past their late 20s or whatever it was. And I think
Mhm.
what we're seeing right now from Courtney Vandersloot in this series it just stands out to me so much in that regard.
Yeah, the longevity of it all. I think, and she's still in like closing lineups, like she still gets mixed around here. It's like, yes, she's been moved to the bench, but like it has opened up so much more creatively for these lineups that Sandy kind of chooses to go with. So, yeah, I totally agree with everything you said. I will say the Aces look better in game two. It was only a 4-point game. They was back and forth for a while there. They go back to Vegas now, where I'd say they have a pretty good chance to snag a game here. What do you want to see from them for them to stay alive for game three?
Yeah, I think they got to start getting back a little bit better in transition defense, and I think Becky talked about it, in her post game after game one. Like three regular season matchups with New York, they gave up 8 points per game in transition. They're giving up 15 points per game in transition in this series, basically double. And after game one, like Becky talked about, she said, uh, uh, paraphrasing here, like we can't just get 2 offensive rebounds and not get back in transition. And last week or maybe 2 weeks ago on this pod, we talked about how like offensive rebounding isn't really a part of the Aces game. Like they're last in the league, especially when they play New York, because they're so focused on taking away those fast break opportunities for New York. And like in the regular season, New York allowed under 3 offensive rebounds 3 times. It was the 3 times they played the Aces in game 1. Again, only 2 offensive rebounds. Like, that's not the Aces finally got on the O glass a little bit in game 2, but the second part of what Becky said, I think is where she like hit the nail on the head. And not guard in transition. Like, if you're not going to be hitting offensive rebounds, you have to be guarding in transition. You have to get back in transition. You can't not do one and also not do the other and expect to beat a good team like the Liberty. And so I think in game 3, like, that's something I'm really looking for with how the Liberty are able to push the ball is for Las Vegas to be looking to take that away. And it'll also help if they hit shots like they did in game 2, because when you hit shots and make New York take it out of the net, obviously that makes transition a little bit harder as well. But that's gonna be a key, I think.
Yeah, and speaking of more of that like offensive rebounding presence, which I guess I don't know, give or take, but Kia Stokes goes down with a possible concussion. Very serious. That was just a really bad way to segue into that. But how does that kind of affect Vegas moving forward? Because now you're down a body, especially if it is a concussion. I think it's safe to assume, and it looked pretty serious, like that collision with Jonkwell there, and like a bit of a weird whistle, I think, in game 2, calling that a hostile act. I think going back and watching that is very clear that it's not. So hopefully she's okay, but how does this affect Vegas moving forward?
Yeah, like you said, they're down a body. They need bodies. I think last week we sort of went through the pros and cons of all the different options that they have as kind of the fifth player next to their core four, and Kia Stokes, and Tip Hayes and Alicia Clark, and kind of settled on like Alicia Clark probably being that best option, despite maybe like giving up some size. And I think Becky sort of settled on that too when she moved to Alicia Clark in the starting lineup in the third quarter, or coming out of halftime of game 1 and then in game 2. But like, you still need all 3 of those players to give you minutes if you really want to have a chance, I think, because like, this isn't a deep team. Obviously, the Aces, even with Kia Stokes in the lineup, it's not a deep team. And now you just take one player, presumably. I guess we don't know for sure, but like you said, it seems like she might not be available for game 3. Like, you're gonna have to rely really, really heavily on now Alicia and Tip, and also that starting lineup. I honestly think like 2 or 3 of the core 4 might end up playing 40 or at least like 39 in this game. I think we could see 40 out of Asia in this game, elimination game at home without Kia Stokes now. And this,
Yeah.
like, if she goes off in 40 minutes without getting a minute of rest, like, this could be a legacy game for her. But
Mhm.
we'll see if we see any Kate Martin or not. I don't know if they want to go to Kate Martin, but obviously she did do some good things earlier in the season when they were relying on her. So it's going to be a big challenge for Becky, I think, to manage the really, really razor thin rotations.
Yeah, for sure. And I think they're gonna be relying on some of that crowd support now to maybe help them get through that. Because that, I mean, Barclays was like really, really loud, and I think that obviously like helps the players too, like to have a crowd going behind them. So there's gonna be a lot of different factors now. They got to deal with the 3-hour time change because Lord knows that's a hard one to adjust to. But yeah, anything else you want to hit on with this series before we move on to Sun-Lynx?
Yeah, I don't think so. I've just been thoroughly impressed with New York compared to where they were a year ago.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think they've done a lot of really great things, and I think it really sticks out that they are a different team than they were last year. And even like before we move on, like Benija looked more comfortable in game 2. I think right out the gate, she knocks down an open three, which is something that she hadn't done so far in the playoffs. She had really good moves in addition to like all the other good things that she does on defense and just like within as like a cog in New York's offensive machine. So yeah, I think like just having that, having your players become more comfortable as the series goes along. That comes with experience. That comes with just like getting better reps together, and it's definitely showing for New York. But let's talk about this other series: Minnesota Lynx versus Connecticut Sun. Minnesota bounces back to even up the series. We are at 1-1. This series has been so physical. My goodness. The players are practically like boxing each other at this point. Like Marina has gotten on everybody's nerves, whether that's like her own former teammates in college with K-Mac, her own former teammates in Chicago with Courtney Williams, getting into it with Fee, who like doesn't really nor like Fee is pretty feisty. I think she's more feisty than like she appears to be, but like she doesn't really like go at players the way that she went at Marina in like the first like 5 minutes of the game. So like it's been a physical series so far. It's been feisty. I think the first game was more back and forth. Game two was back and forth to start, but then I think Minnesota just kind of took control, and Connecticut had one of its worser games of the playoffs. How does this like? How does the feistiness? How does the physicality? How does all this speak to the way that these two teams match up on the floor?
Yeah, I think it's what we talked about a few weeks ago with like obviously these two defenses, top two defenses in the league, like they're not the same in terms of their style or like, schematically or anything like that, but in terms of just sheer level of dog and like toughness and tenacity, like these are the two defenses in the league that have that more than anyone else. And when you add in all of that to like a playoff intensity type of atmosphere, this is what you get. You get like a slugfest. And so, I mean, I'm here for it. It's playoff basketball.
I love it. I actually love it so much. Watching Sun-Lynx game two was really, really fun. But let's break down both these games. What went well for the Sun in game one and what didn't versus what didn't in game two, to have them lose that second one.
Yeah, I think part of it is shot making. Like what I think you're seeing the Lynx have a little bit more margin for error offensively and a little bit more depth in terms of their shot making. Cause like you said, you got the two best defenses in the league. So what's going to separate you? It's going to be, can you score in this game or in this series? And like in game one, Sun shoot over 40% from three. Like Marina Mabry went off, leading scorer, hitting deep bombs all over the place. Game two, Sun shoot 25% from three. Mabry's 2 for 8. Like that was a big difference in the game. But on the other side, like Nafisa shot 3 for 14 in game two, only scored 9 points. If you told me that before the game, I would have said the Lynx are in trouble. But it's because of the depth that the Lynx have and the different offensive options and shot makers that they have, that they're able to sustain a shooting like that from Fee, because you have like Bridget, you have K-Mac, you have all these different players who can fill it up. And I think that's what has kind of been the difference. That was the difference in game two, and what may end up being the difference in this series between these two teams is just the depth of scoring options that the Lynx have.
For sure. And speaking of scoring options, Courtney Williams, 17 points. She like was a big part of why Minnesota was able to win this because like you even look at the rest of this roster, Bridget entered foul trouble super early. She racked up 3 fouls like within the first half. And so like to see Courtney like step out and get those 17 points, what do you think about her performance and how Minnesota was able to bounce back in game two?
Yeah, I think you called her an X Factor last week, right? On our live show. And her
Hmm.
dad was in the house going crazy. You gotta love Courtney Williams' dad. And she showed up. And again, like you mentioned, Bridget foul trouble. Like that's another, you have someone like that getting foul trouble, like someone like Courtney Williams steps up. Like that's what the Lynx have this year. And I think that's been the biggest thing for them, is that if Courtney Williams gets in foul trouble next game, they're gonna have someone else step up and hit shots and take over some of that scoring load for them. Maybe Natisha Heidemann comes in, or maybe, Bridget has one of her games. She goes off and hits some cold shots. Like there's going to be someone. And so like depth has been, I mean, we talked about the Aces lack of depth. I think in both series, depth has been a really big factor.
Yeah, what do you think about Minnesota's bench? Because they also had Sandelasini come back for this game after missing game one. You talked about Maisha Hines Allen. Let's talk about that jumper to end the quarter on the buzzer. That was insane, and she was fired up. But yeah, what do you think about Minnesota's bench? Because I think they were great.
Yeah, what a tough angle on that, right? And got it to go at the
And
buzzer.
so quick too, like
Yeah.
immediately release that. Like that is some Hooper like level things.
Yeah, no question. And like they're getting that off the bench, and they're getting, I mean, Natisha Heidemann, like I said, playing great minutes off the bench, backing up Courtney Williams, and then like having Zandalasini like underrated reason why they played better in game 2, I think, than game 1, having her come back. Uh,
Agree.
with some of the tight rotations that you see in the playoffs, like the Lynx are still able to comfortably play 8 players significant minutes and have big contributions from all of them, I think, on both ends of the floor. And that's just been really big. So I was very impressed with their bench in game 2. Yeah.
I totally agree. All right. Keys for game three. How do you see this going, and what does each team need to do on their end to secure the W?
Yeah, honestly, if you're the Lynx, you're always going to be trying to make adjustments and get better or whatever. But like, you're 1-1, but I think you've been the better team. You've outscored them overall. I think you caught the Sun on, like I said, a hot shooting night in game 1. You can kind of keep doing what you're doing. I think you have the advantage in this series right now, even though you are going to Connecticut. And then if you're the Sun, I think you got to find a way to get Bree Jones involved somehow. And I understand, like, so defensively, she's kind of being played off the floor right now. And what you're seeing, like, she played 8 minutes in the first quarter, 6 the rest of the game last night. Like, they're going small a lot more because she's had a hard time keeping up with the quickness of the Lynx front court.
Um,
But I think on the other end, like, as good as the Lynx defense has been, the one weakness for them all year, because of the quickness of the front court, they don't have as much size in the front court and defensive rebounding. They're third to last in the league in defensive rebounding rate. Bree Jones is the perfect player to take advantage of that if she's able to stay on the floor. One of the better offensive rebounders in the league the last few years. Like, if you can find ways to craft your defense and be able to steal some minutes from her here or there and get something out of her offensively, like, I think that can change the series. But that's a big challenge for Steph White. And it's going to be interesting to see, like, if they figure that out or if they end up just continuing to lean more and more into the smaller lineups and into obviously Nelson Adota as well, because that does seem to be what matches up better with the Lynx personnel and the style that they play. Just size wise and quickness wise. But I think, like, I mean, Steph White was coach of the year last year, so she's pretty intelligent and she knows what she's doing. We'll see
yeah.
how that goes.
That's so true though. Like it has been very obvious that Connecticut's been sticking more with that smaller lineup, and like Bree has been having a bit of a harder time kind of integrating herself and like becoming a presence that like you would keep in for longer minutes. So it is an interesting kind of problem to have, especially now that the series is leveled, and like how you kind of counter that. Like you said, going on home court in game three, and seeing what goes from there. But speaking of the games, let's give you the games to watch for this week. It's a lot more spread out. So you will listen to this episode a day before games, which gives you plenty of time to prep and make plans. The first game on Friday will actually be Minnesota Lynx versus Connecticut Sun. It's been the other way around so far. Um, I'm really excited for this one. That'll be at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on ESPN2 in the States. It will probably be on TV here in Canada too. Everything's been televised so far, but I just don't know which channel it will be yet. But I think it's safe to assume that it'll be on TSN. Followed by Liberty Aces at 9:30 p.m. Eastern on ESPN2. We'll see if the Liberty can wrap this one up in a sweep, or if the defending champs are going to put a little bit of a scare and snag game three. Very interested to see how that one goes. But yeah, Cal, we're like, what's like the thoughts that are kind of creeping into my head as like we kind of go through the playoffs is like, this has been amazing basketball. And then I think to myself, what am I gonna do when it's over? It's like it's about to be that time. And like, yes, college basketball is starting up again soon. And then I get overwhelmed about the thought of college basketball starting up again soon because of
I was
how
about to
many
say,
teams we're gonna have to be on top of. So it's
yeah.
just like that weird like in between where you're just like, oh my God, what is going on? What a problem to have working in sports, eh?
Oh yeah, basketball never stops. It's 365 days a year. I love it.
Yeah. But yeah, thanks for rocking with us for today's episode. I know we went a little bit longer, but there was a lot to get into. I hope everyone enjoys the semifinal matchups on Friday. We'll see what happens after that. You make sure you're following Her Hoop Stats on all things social media and wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you're subscribed to us on YouTube because that's the best place to watch Coast to Coast. You can follow myself at Crina MM. You can follow Cal at Wetzel 31, and we will see you next week.